Alright, this is going to be the short version of the Principles of a Typography lecture for Photoshop, going over the different types of fonts. So I'm going to do this quickly and try to zip through this. There are various types of fonts, and each font does kind of send a different message based on the way that it appears. So you can see on here, for instance, this Perry Hotter font has a very different look than, say, The Godfather or Grinched or this other one down here. Fonts typically are going to fall in various categories, ranging from sans serif, serif, script, decorative, and then even sometimes what we'll call grunge fonts. So I'm going to break those down for you. First off with sans serif fonts. Sans means without, apparently, like in French or something. I don't know languages. But anyway, so sans serif would be fonts that do not have serifs. So they're basically clean, straight fonts. You don't see anything hanging off of the letters of these fonts. They're just straight lines, very simple fonts. These are good for headings, good for printed text, and they're especially easy to read online. Serif fonts are easier to read in print, like textbooks. They're a little more old-fashioned and traditional, and some examples of that are going to be things like Times New Roman, Book Antiqua, Courier New. And notice on these fonts you're going to see little hangy-down things, little dangling things, little pieces, feet, if you will, on certain letters. Those little things are called serifs. So serif fonts have serifs. Sans serif fonts do not have serifs. Script fonts are fonts that are kind of hard to use, or hard to read, so we don't use them very often. Typically, these are kind of flowery fonts. You're going to use them on wedding invitations or maybe formal menus. And there are also casual script fonts that might be more fun, girly fonts, you might say. Your script fonts are going to be like some of these examples. They look a little bit more handwritten or in cursive, and that's going to classify those as script fonts. So handwritten or cursive looking fonts are going to be script fonts. Kind of one of the categories that all the cool looking fonts fall into is going to be decorative or display fonts. You can use those words interchangeably. Decorative fonts are sometimes hard to read, so you want to use them sparingly. They're fun for posters, they're good for headings. So some of these examples here, like Joker Man, you can see it's got a lot of all kinds of stuff hanging off. And most of these decorative or display fonts, you could argue, also fall into the category of serif or sans serif, because they either do or don't have those serifs. But because they kind of go above and beyond, and they have sort of their own personality, we put them into this decorative or display category. An example of a decorative or display font category within the category would be grunge fonts. And these are going to be fonts that have sort of like pieces missing from them. They look like they've been beat up or washed in the washing machine. Deteriorated fonts with beaten up parts are considered grunge fonts. Some fun fonts can be found in the dingbat category. That's going to be that category that includes things like wingdings or webdings. And we use these as symbols. A lot of times they are used for bullets or for accents. So for instance, here's one called alienator. So like when you type A, you get this, and B, you get this, and C, you get this cute little alien, and so forth and so on. So the letters are represented by symbols in a dingbat font. But the category is dingbat, and then the names of these fonts would be webdings, wingdings, or American Indian, or alienator, or whatever that font is called. So you can't read them as far as the letters go, but they are symbol font sets. So looking at these two in your head, decide which one of these would be a serif font. And it would be the bottom one, because there are little dangly serifs and feet and pieces hanging off of the different letters. This one doesn't have those, so it would be sans serif. It is without serifs. There are no serifs to be found. Alright, so looking at these two, which would be decorative? Hopefully you answered the bottom one, grilled cheese, because it's kind of a fat, funky font. The top one is more cursive or handwritten, and so it would be a script font. Alright, another term, and these things can be changed in Photoshop using the character panel, is called kerning. Now, kerning is the distance between a letter pair. That means like between this T and this E. If I wanted them to be closer together or farther apart, I would kern the letters. Kerning is just between a letter pair. Tracking refers to kerning all letters. So if I have a whole block of text, a whole word, or a whole paragraph, it's actually, the technical term for that would be tracking. When the letters between all of those are spaced out in a whole big block, it's called tracking. Leading, which looks like leading, but it's actually called leading, refers to line spacing or the distance between lines. And so you can see here, like for instance, the distance between this line and this line, there's a little bit more, and here they're closer together. In Photoshop, a lot of times they don't, if you're typing something that's more than one line, it kind of does an awkward amount of space. And so a lot of times I do decrease the leading so that they're a little bit closer together. Then you have text styles, bold, italics, underline, shadow. Those can also be accessed in the character panel in Photoshop at the bottom of the character panel. And those are just what we would call styles. Something else to note about font is that font is measured in points. So whenever you choose 10, 12, 24, that's actually a points measurement. 72 points equal an inch. And so you can see the examples of the difference between 12 point, 24 point, 36, and 48 here. Fonts do have lots of different parts to them. I'm not asking you to memorize all parts, but I do want you to understand that there is this imaginary baseline that runs at the bottom of a font. Think in terms of like when you were in first grade or kindergarten and you had to write on that special paper. What they sit on, that's the baseline. Anything below the baseline is called a descender. So this P and this Y have this little part that hangs below the baseline. That is a descender. This L has a part that goes above that little middle line, which on your paper when you were a little kid was the little dashy line. Those are called ascenders. So certain letters, the tall letters, have ascenders that go above what we call the X height, which is the height of a lowercase x. What go above the X height, those are called ascenders. And then we have alignment. Most everybody is familiar with left, center, and right. The one alignment most people are not familiar with is what's called justified. With justified, all the words line up on the left and on the right. And so what happens is the computer automatically increases spacing between some letters to make that fit. You see this in the newspaper sometimes, is sometimes they mess it up and you'll see like two words on a line in a column because it spaced them out, and one's all the way at the left and one's all the way at the right. But that's called justified. One other concept you can use is called reverse text. Now this is not words that are typed backwards or in mirror, but rather words that are on a dark background, light words on a dark background. It's kind of a nice way if you're not going to use a lot of color to create emphasis. Alright, with regards to mixing fonts, if you're doing any kind of activity where you have to utilize fonts, you do want to make sure that you have a definitive change between fonts if you're going to use two different fonts close to each other. Here, there are some different fonts going on, but they're so close that it almost looks like you just messed up and forgot to change this one to match these. So if you're going to use a different font, you want it to be significantly different. So a different style, a different weight. This one is bolder, and it's actually a sans serif font mixed with these serif fonts below. Alright, I'm going to bang through a couple of these. So as review, what is that? It would be a serif. What category of font would this be? And again, we're looking for the little serifs hanging off of things, so it would be a serif font. Here, this would be sans serif. There are no serifs, so sans serif. Here you obviously see no letters, so this would be a symbol font, which is called dingbat. This would be an example of a grunge font. And this would be an example of a script font. Now I won't go through all of these for the purpose of the review here. But you can see there's lots of different font styles used in many different ways. Alright, this little part that hangs above would be considered the ascender, and this part that goes below would be the descender. Alright, the last thing is that you can download fonts if you can't find the fonts you want on your computer. Honestly, you can just Google free fonts, but one of my favorites is defont.com and refont.com. Some fonts even have a cool preview option where you can type a word in and it will show you what that word looks like in that font. The problem with fonts is most of them when you download them are zip files, which means you have to open them, extract them, and then install them. So when you find the font, you have to download the Windows version. Then when it asks you what to do with it, you're going to open it. Once you open it, you're going to find the button to extract it. Once you go to extract it, you want to show the files to extract it. And then when it opens, double click it, and then the font will pop up. And at that point, you can install the font. Do remember that fonts will only work on that computer where you downloaded it. So if you go to another computer and that font doesn't exist on that computer, it won't work in your project. So as an example, I'll download a font really quickly. So let's say I want this Rock's Death font. So I'm going to come and click on download. I'm going to open that font. When it comes up, I'm going to extract all files. I'm going to be sure the check mark is checked, and I'm going to extract. Here's the font. I'm going to double click it, and I'm going to choose to install. Now you probably don't have rights in other rooms to install on this campus. So if you're in ISS or you're in another classroom, you're not considered power users in those rooms, but in my classroom you are. And if you're at home, you certainly should be. So when you click on install, it should go through the process and install the font. And then when you get into any program, Word, PowerPoint, whatever, you should see that font in there. So now Rock's Death should be a font that's available for me to use. So if I go in here, I should be able to find it on my list. Of course, I got to get to my R's. And sometimes you have to restart the program for it to locate your fonts. But that's basically how it works. And so if you don't see your font immediately on your font list, you would just want to reset that font or reset that program so that you can indeed find that font. But it should be on your font list the next time you open the program. All right, and that's it. That's basically the principles of typography in Photoshop.